Good evening and welcome to Phillips Mill Community Association's Art Talk. I'm Laura Womack and Jen McHugh, our executive producer, is here as well.
Hi, everyone.
Phillips Mill is synonymous with the Pennsylvania Impressionists. We were their home base, even as they showed nationally. But our 93-year history includes many other artists and artistic styles. One artist who was integral to our arts community was Katharine Steele Renninger, active until 2004. In contrast to the Impressionists who documented our beautiful landscape, Renninger was a realist who focused on the everyday objects of Bucks County life, things like baby carriages or Windsor chairs, or even the details of a staircase. Katharine's work is spare and elegant. She saw the patterns of line and light in the quotidian. Her paintings are as much of a paean to Bucks County living as the famous landscapes. Katharine's work has been compared to important American modernists such as Charles Sheeler, Charles Demuth, Edward Hopper. She was highly decorated, winning prizes at the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the Woodmere Art Museum. In 1975, she was named Distinguished Pennsylvania Artist. She was also instrumental in founding the Michener Art Museum. I'm very happy to welcome our guests for a look back at the work of Katharine Steele Renninger. We have Sally Henriquez. Welcome to ArtTalk.
Hello, good evening.
Sally is Katharine's daughter. She and her siblings coordinated the family's gift of Katharine's work and archives to the Michener Art Museum. Sally worked as a healthcare professional. She is now on the board of Phillips Mill Community Association and Fisherman's Mark. Welcome also to curator Liz Sheehan.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Liz Sheehan curated the Michener's retrospective Katharine Steele Renninger Craft Commitment Community. She's also curated exhibits at the Hicks Art Gallery and the Hunterdon Art Museum, among others. She holds degrees in art history and museum studies from Bowdoin College and Tufts University. Like Renninger, she also serves on the Art Education Trust Board at the Bucks County Intermediate Union. And thank you all for joining us in the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll take as many as we can. And let's get started right off with artwork. Jen, what are we looking at first?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we have 3 quilts in a cupboard, and we talked about the quotidian, the everyday. And I think it's very clear that folded quilts put in casually in the back of a cabinet, it doesn't get any more everyday than that. Liz?
Yeah, this is actually, you chose one of my favorite paintings to start with. For sure, quilts were a common subject for Katharine. I think both the interest in pattern and design, she had a really strong design background, and so the quilt spoke to her for that level, but also because they were handmade. And one of the through lines of her career was an interest in preserving handmade objects from this area, much like the Henry Mercer Museum, where she spent a lot of time. If you know that collection, that's the kind of impetus for selecting some of the objects that she painted. So I just love this painting in particular. There's a lot in here that you see throughout her work. The division of the canvas into this kind of grid made with the shelves in the cabinet, the shadows in the back of the cabinet, and this contrast with the bright colors of the quilts, the strong lines, and then this very cropped composition is really pretty typical of her work. And I also love that the top third of the painting is almost a completely different work in itself, where she has that vase sitting on the top of the cabinet, and you get the sense in here too of her, the interest in the sort of border between abstraction and realism that is so typical of her work.
Sally, I understand she had a lot of collections of different kinds of objects.
My mother was a collector. Our house and the gardens were really an extension of her artwork. Nothing was new, but she would have new acquisitions and she would rearrange things. So she would have a huge collection. I don't think you can see behind me, of ironstone china. She would have medicine bottles. She would have copper pots that many had come from my grandparents, but she would continue to add to that. She loved crocks, the stone crocks that would have distal finks on them. But every time something came into the house, there was a process to how to organize it. Yes, she was a collector.
She was a collector. Very nice. Let's take a look at the next painting we have up. It's Jams and Jellies. It's the same painting that is gracing Jen's background. And again, with the quotidian, I think these humble canning jars, are interesting. They're haphazard. It's not a romantic composition. And yet, nevertheless, she's called our attention to them. So I almost think of it as like a found art in a way, different from a sculpture, but what do you think?
Yeah, I love this piece too. This is, I think, pretty typical in her interest in repetition and the rhythm and pattern created by objects in a scene. She has, in the archive at the Michener, I wouldn't say thousands of photographs of objects that she took, just out and about. And you can see that when you compare them with the painting, the final painting, they're really, just kind of a document of what she saw. And so this composition wasn't necessarily how she found these objects arranged. There was some invention happening, but, certainly the color would have caught her eye. The repetition of the jars and the ribbons hanging down. And also just the moment, right? This is like a county fair where, I think pretty well known to anyone who grew up in this area or a similar area, summer event where your jams and jellies, these handmade things again, are getting judged. But also, again, this really strong grid that she's created with the shelves, the division of the canvas, and the interest in shadow, I think is pretty apparent here as well. And that's something you see very often in her paintings.
Sally, do you have thoughts associated with this, whether it's from a painter perspective or personal?
Well, I think that just kind of sentimentally, my mother's sister and her husband were farmers and were very active in the Middletown Grange here in this area. So for those of you that have been around forever, it was a very competitive scene to enter your jams and your jellies. And my aunt was really involved with that. So this always makes me think about my Aunt Ellen. But I think, my mother she made jams and jellies. The kitchen would be strewn with the bags dripping the fruit through the thing overnight. And you would come down in the morning and there would clearly always be a slight mess, but it was just part of what went on in the kitchen. Yeah.
So, I mean, we started with these because they are such everyday objects. I think that really emphasizes that was important to Katharine Renninger, but it's just a coincidence that these are what one might call feminine subjects. And I want to address that right off because she was not interested in she was a serious painter. She went to art school and she wasn't interested in being dismissed as, a Sunday painter, I think you said, Sally.
Mm-hmm. So I think she did, I guess I'm going to speak to this, but she did take her painting very seriously. She considered it her job, her profession. As young children and throughout our, adolescence and moving into adulthood, we were very clear that when she was painting, that was when she was working. And her studio was adjacent to the kitchen. We lived in an old house in Newtown. And so she was able to go in and get her coffee and come back and paint. But when people visited, she didn't like people to just drop by. And if they did drop by, she had a very uncomfortable bench in her studio. So it wasn't a welcoming space that you could settle in and have an hour and a half conversation with her. She loved people, but I think she really considered when she was painting, that was her time to work.
So very strategic thinking. I'm impressed by that. We do have a question I think this is in the chat rather than the Q&A. We'll go ahead and take it. I love to take as many questions from the audience as we can. Please put them in the Q&A. What have we got, Jen?
I apologize if I mispronounce this, but is Cassian difficult to paint with? Is it like oils or more like tempera?
Oh.
So it's a tempera, like a sour milk based paint, and it's not like oil at all. Actually, that's why Katharine chose to paint with casein, because it's a very dry medium, and you can see this in the surface of her canvas. You can almost see every individual brush stroke. I think it was it had a very slow hand. And she really liked that sense of control. And that's, I think, from the very beginning of her career, what she settled on and used, almost to the exclusion of any other media.
Sally, thoughts about your mother and casein? Is that how we're saying?
It is casein, yes. She really did not like oil. She did not really like watercolors, and casein was her medium. And she had I don't know, we don't have a photo of it, but it wasn't easy to purchase. Not many artists used it. So she had a supplier, and she was very organized about making sure she never ran out of this whole range of colors. Yeah.
All right. And we've got before we go on, let's we've got another question.
This is a follow-up from Mindy. Did she make her own paint?
Not to my knowledge.
No.
All right, good. Oh, well, we're getting a bunch of questions. I knew we were going to have a lot to talk about today. Let's move forward with one more question before we go back to the paintings, Jen.
Okay, this is Laura Igo, the current head curator at the Michener. And she said, "Hi, everyone. I'm excited to learn more about Renninger, whose work is so important to the Michener and its collection. Her subjects are everyday objects, but not necessarily modern everyday objects. Can you speak a bit about nostalgia in her work?"
You want to take that, Sally? You look like you're.
I think that she was very attached. I mean, she was very attached to this area. She was very attached to things that were interesting to her, though. So she was attached to tractor seats, as Laura mentioned earlier, baby carriages, staircases, rocking chairs on front porches. She wasn't really interested in anything that was what we would call new, but she would move from a collection to another collection. They would go to Martha's Vineyard, and she loved the porches in Oak Bluffs that would have the Japanese lanterns, once a year on the porches. So I think that definitely she had objects that she favored very strongly.
I think too, there's also she was really interested in preservation. I think there was almost a sense of, not wanting these important sort of the material culture of this place to disappear. That, I think I read somewhere that she almost was a little bit angry at the sort of, disposability inherent to new objects. And she loved the sense of permanence and history in the handmade things. And I think that there's there can be a tendency toward nostalgia in some of her paintings, but the strong sense of design really keeps it from going, too overboard.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm interested to hear Laura Igo's question. And welcome, Laura. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I guess it makes me think, because I look at her work and I don't see it as sentimental. I guess the choice of objects in and of itself is a nostalgia. So that's a great point, Laura. But I think the way she treats it is very calmly. I'm trying to think of the right word, but it is without a sentimentality, I guess, that would be unpleasant.
Yeah, there's a critical distance there.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another look at her work. And I love the title of this, especially in the context of this discussion: Steps and Pig Troughs. So this is not a so-called feminine subject matter. So clearly and she did have an interest in the architecture. We were talking about that earlier. Who wants to talk about this painting first?
I can take it. She had, I think this is the painting that really speaks to her interest in Charles Sheeler. She loved to paint steps. She talked about that as one of her, primary interests. Looking at it, of course, in this, I think it's pretty apparent that she's looking at the geometry, but also, again, the hand-built architecture was certainly an interest, in line and shadow. And she, I think she once said that she loved to paint steps and nobody else was doing it. So I know that while she was a huge fan of Charles Sheeler, it's also not known, how much of his work she was familiar with. So, but there's definitely some clear, and I talk about this in the catalog as well, some clear overlaps in thinking about architecture as design. And again, the tight cropping is very clear here. The way that she's looking at this space, not as a space that you enter, but as a collection of horizontals and verticals. And so I think that that's something that she repeated, throughout her career, was this interest. And it also, and we can talk about this later with some of the other work, she was very interested in photography, not as a medium that she used herself. I mentioned before that she used it mostly to document objects and arrangements of objects out, in the world. But I think she had a very photographic eye, and I think that's really apparent in this work.
Sally, did you want to add to that?
I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, steps are an interesting thing to be interested in painting. I'm not sure that they've entered my consciousness as their own thing. So again, it's her eye for the unusual, for the detail. But Liz, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that if you're familiar at all with the work of that Charles Sheeler did in Doylestown, there's staircase after staircase. So I think that, one of those catalogs, I'm sure, came through Katharine's collection at some point or another.
Right, and she does have many paintings of steps, which I particularly enjoy. We have a related question, I believe, Jen, in the Q&A.
Yes, sorry. Did she ever work from photos?
Yeah, I would answer that question. I think originally she did a lot of her paintings from sketches, and then as she moved along, she used her camera and she used her photographs to paint from quite a bit.
All right, good. Thank you very much for that. And we were talking earlier about her seriousness as an artist, and at a time when women were more frequently in nursing or teaching, it was hard for her to become an artist, wasn't it, Sally?
It was she made a choice, and I guess she started taking art lessons as a young child. My grandparents, they had moved out to Feasterville when it was still a very rural area, and Arthur Meltzer and his wife Paulette Van Roken were neighbors, and they suggested that she had some talent, and my mother took art lessons with them. Actually, my sister said she earned the money to pay for the art lessons by raising turkeys. So, my mother was quite a character. And when it came time after high school, she went to the local public school. She wanted to go to art school, and my grandfather didn't really have a great respect for this idea. And so my grandmother said, well, then Jack, I'll pay for her to go to art school. And she went on to Moore College of Art. And it was really where I believe at least one of the Meltzers were on the faculty there. It was a real transitional time. And it was really important to her that her mother supported her.
And that's so unusual that her mother, felt so strongly about her daughter becoming an artist. I mean, she must have been an extraordinary person as well.
She was.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see what's up next. Okay. Here we are. I have to look a little closer to see what we're looking at. Rod's corn sheller. And so I think here we're, I think, Liz, I read in your catalog that she sort of borders on the abstract, or she considered herself an abstractionist. I think you see that here where you're looking at realism, but it's been so distilled that it does enter that abstract world.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think she was also very interested in mechanical objects, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, her grandfather was an engineer, or her father was an engineer.
Yeah. Yes.
That's right. So we had those drafting tools are in the Michener's collection as part of the archive, and I exhibited those in the show to make that connection because she was really interested in tools. And again, these parts of the corn sheller themselves, the design element of them would have been a strong interest of her, and of course the looking at the grid of this framework behind the tool, and then the wheel itself and the gears. She, again, this, strong cropping was a way for her to abstract an object as well. And the way that we're so up close to it, we can almost imagine using it. But I also want to point out all the objects that you see behind in the back of the room, I guess, which is probably where we're looking. She loved to paint these different layers, and where they almost are flattened on the canvas as another design element. She talked about, and I'm sure we'll see this again in later work, she loved to paint things through things, is how she sort of called it, that, you're kind of, there's a less of sort of distinction between those objects, but they form a pattern of themselves.
Sally, did she talk to you and your siblings about, her theories of art, or, realism versus abstract art?
So not specifically, but I think that she was very clear about what she painted and what she wanted to paint. I'm not sure I'm answering your direct question, but she didn't question what she was doing. She painted what she saw and what she wanted to see, and she wasn't painting to please others. What she put on the canvas was what she really believed in.
That's remarkable accomplishment in and of itself. I think there is a lot of really accomplished artists who are not there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I appreciate all the questions we're getting in the Q&A. Let's take a couple of those, Jen, and keep them coming.
Okay, Jim Feld said that this, in response to Rod's corn sheller, reminds him of the abandoned houses we used to find hiking in the woods of central New Jersey. Always afraid as kids to wander in, but we did and found so many antique things. Then we have, I'm sorry, Laura.
That's nice. Thanks, Jim.
Yes. And then Nancy and George Pickering have a question. They said, we have two of Renninger's paintings. Does someone keep track of her works that are not housed in public collections?
Good question. I would, contact the Michener and let them know that you have them. I must, when I was putting this exhibition together, I contacted as many collectors as I could find, through the museum. So I'm sure they'd be interested in knowing what you have, and I'd be interested in know what you have, just to, because there were objects that I would, find in the course of my research, reproduced in articles, or that she would mention, or that I saw in her ledger that we can talk about later, that I just couldn't locate. So of course, it's always great to know where these paintings ended up.
Sally, do you know where all of her works are?
No, I agree with what Liz just said. I mean, I think that as we'll reference the ledger again, but my mother kept really copious records of all of her paintings and details and when they were sold, but we haven't had a follow through over the years. And there are resale of her paintings, we know, through auction houses and through private sales, donations to various things, but we really don't have a good base of where things are.
No. All right, Jen, let's take a look at Main and Orange Street. And I think the composition of this, it's a working structure. It's very elegant. And again, it's a complex pattern, but it's rendered so, I don't know, simply or straightforward. I find that in her work consistently. There's a directness.
Yeah, and I think this one is, it's one of the more complex ones, and also speaks to her interest in painting glass, and the ability of glass to both reflect reflect objects, but also to see through it, of course. And so there is this wonderful confusion that I find in this work and in some of the other ones where she's painting windows, where you don't quite know what you're looking at or where you're standing in relation to what she's painting. And this is one of them. So it almost, the first time I saw this, I thought, are we looking at a crated painting? Because but actually, as I read more about the work, it's this cross brace that you see, on the surface is actually scaffolding. And then we're looking at a, building through a window with scaffolding in the front of it. So there are many different layers here. And then of course there's reflections of windows beyond and then behind. And so there's this really wonderful, again, this confusion, but a dislocation, I think, that some of her best architectural work really has at its heart. And there's again, the idea of abstraction, this sort of grid to organize things, the frame and the window frame being of the same scale is really important to this work. So there's a lot happening here that, speaks to many of the interests that she had in painting.
All the layers. Sally, reaction on this one?
Well, just the only comment, because Liz has referenced her, the architectural base of some of these paintings. And just an anecdote is that at some point, and I don't really know, maybe it was in the 80s, maybe the 90s, my mother had a show at the Newman Gallery in Philadelphia, and Louis Kahn was there, and he was looking at one of her paintings and commenting on her, he didn't realize that she was the artist and she was listening to him, but he was saying how architectural it was in form. And so I think she was always really deeply pleased about that. Yeah. And yes, she did have, both her father and grandfather were engineers, but it's interesting to hear Liz keep referencing that. I never really ever thought about it in the past. Long past, I guess.
It's interesting. All right, let's take a look at U-Pen shells with bikes. I enjoy this one a lot, and I think it really shows the beauty that she's able to achieve with, and I'll never be able to say this, casein, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
I just think that, I mean, it's such a smoothness, but there's also the texture, I think, is really fascinating to me.
Sally, do you want to talk about your family connection to the shells paintings?
Right. So as I said earlier, my mother would kind of, I don't want to use the word latch on to different collections, but my husband was an oarsman and he rode a pen. And at some point we must have visited one of the boathouses down in Philadelphia, and my mother was just captivated. And so she did several paintings of different shells and different, I think at least two different boathouses. But I think that it goes back to, again, her design and her abstract, the view of it, and the shadows. We really love them, obviously, because we feel very close to them.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah, these are a wonderful group. I think I had 4 or 5 of them in the exhibition, because it was really interesting to see how she often did this, return to the same subject again and again, to paint them from different viewpoints, include different elements in different canvases. But she also would switch between this horizontal composition. Some of them were vertical, so she could emphasize different elements of the space. But again, this idea of using a column in the room to divide the canvas. And so you can see it both as an arrangement of shapes, but also this space that she was entering in. And just this one, I think, has wonderful color as well. Many of her paintings are pretty muted, but this series, I think, really capitalizes on, these kind of the bold colors that she found in the boats.
Yeah, great point about the color, because I react to that too in this one. Jen, we have some comments and some questions. What do we got?
I just have to say that I remember these were the paintings that struck me in the exhibit, and I would go see them again and again, and it just fell in love with them. Anyway, that's an aside. That's my personal. Mindy wants to know, Sally, did your mom take you and your siblings to art museums or galleries as children?
Yes, we went to, it's funny, I didn't mean to chuckle, but we spent a lot of time at museum and galleries and art shows. And a lot of it was for you know, our education and exposure, but it was also for her, and she would gain a lot by being there. She would always have an opinion about, especially not at the established galleries, you know, the museums, but, you know, she always had some comments about what, you know, the artwork and the artist. My sister reminded me, though, I was the youngest of three for a long time, and I was not as well behaved as the other two, but at one point I wandered into a little goldfish pond during a visit to a gallery, and my sister had to go rescue me, and my mother just kind of was very blasé, like, oh, okay, well, let's just keep going. But that was quite a bit of our childhood. Yes.
Very good. Okay, thank you for sharing that,
Yeah,
Sally.
sure.
Okay, what's up next, Jen, with the questions?
John wants to know, is there any documentation of her having a friendship with Andrew Wyeth?
I don't believe she had a direct, you know, relationship, or, you know, I don't think that they were contemporaries that were in close contact. No.
No, and that comparison would come up pretty often in the literature, and she always kind of shrugged it off. It was not a comparison that she, I think, felt was, I'd say flattering is the wrong word, but you know, the connection was made because they were both representational painters. They both use, you know, a tempera-based paint, and their palette is sometimes similar, but that's about it. You know, he obviously tended more toward, he painted abstract ideas and she painted abstract things. And that's, you know, there are lots of other things you could say about that comparison, but I'm also not aware of any personal relationship that they had.
Interesting. Okay, let's take a look at some more artwork. Well, I think men's bathhouse. Yeah, I think this is just fabulous. You can already, I think you can learn her style very quickly from reading your catalog, Liz, but also this conversation. But I'd love to hear your take on this.
I love this one. I think it's really just a sort of masterful shadow study. You know, and again, this idea of looking through doorways, you know, and I'll note, and I'm sure it's been obvious by now, but she never painted people. And she thought they were distracting. She was interested in more, that I'm trying to remember the quote exactly, something about how empty spaces leave more for the viewer's imagination. Right. So you get a much more, I think, a stronger sense of atmosphere here, that this, you know, you can imagine it filled with people, but it's, I think it's much more poetic in its quietness, right? Its stillness. There's this really interesting band of bright green, the window in the center of this canvas that I think is so interesting. I just love to puzzle over the compositional choices that she makes. And the way she uses the edges of the canvas, the scale she chooses for each work, you know, this idea of like, well, we'll give you a little bit of depth in this one, but not much, you know, and that's pretty typical of all of her interiors. You know, you're kind of denied this sense of space as a viewer. She forces you to look at it as a design. I think that's pretty apparent in this one.
Yeah, that's great. Sally, thoughts on this one?
I don't think I can add to that. I think Liz has really captured it. Thanks.
That was really fabulous. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right, two wheelers. Now this is not local, is that right, Sally?
I actually do not remember where that is, but it's certainly an older one, 1964.
I want to say it's Nantucket. Could that be right? Or Martha's Vineyard?
I think I read it was Martha's Vineyard, but
it might be Martha's Vineyard. It was 1964. I apologize that I don't know the location.
Okay. Thoughts, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, again, similar to the one we just saw, this I feel like is a shadow study. And she painted a lot of Victorian architectural elements. And Sally, I mean, is that something that, does she collect Victorian objects as well? Because I mean, the doll carriages fits into that, and some of the some of the photos in the Michener's archive were of that, time period. It seemed to be, was it something she also collected?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just think, again, this one is really interesting in the way that she is not looking at the full house. She's not showing us the top of this roof, if it's a gable or not, but she's really interested in the handcraft of these elements that were applied to the outside of the house. So someone took the time to, carve these pieces, and I'm sure the person that lived here had a real sense of pride in their home. And I think that's what she's kind of capturing, is this design, and of course the shadow, and the way that these, windows don't show us anything, but it's really just the shape and form that she's interested in.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that she cut off the design, which is clearly so important. I mean, it really gives it attention.
Yep.
But anyway, okay, I want to go to Stirple Mill Road, if we can. I will jump a little bit ahead. We're getting a lot of questions, which is wonderful, but I wanted to put this one to you, Sally. We were having a conversation earlier about her architecture, and if you had some thoughts.
This one is just so interesting to me because it's a little bit lighter than what I feel a lot of her work was earlier. It's really complex because you have all these windows and lots going on, and you have a lot of color. I don't know. I think this one is, I didn't always think her paintings all were fun. They were very interesting. And this one I just think is really fun. It's captivating to me.
Liz?
Yeah, I love this one too. I think it's again this interest in windows and what we see and don't see, and what's reflected, what's revealed. It seems to me that we're looking at reflections of fall leaves behind us. So if we're standing in front of this barn, that's what we're seeing, autumn leaves. And then of course we can see through some of these windows. So there's that play there, and then the way that she's zoomed in on the exterior of this barn. Certainly, I would think that the color probably grabbed her attention from the side of the road. But the repetition of windows and the way she sort of set up that composition as well. This is one where she, there were often comparisons made with Edward Hopper and, some of his architectural paintings as well. And again, we already mentioned that she never included people in her work the way he did in some of his interiors. So there isn't that, kind of psychological element, but this is just, sort of a strict interest in the design of these really beautiful old buildings.
I think, Laura, one more thing about this and I'm not sure if we would have mentioned this, my mother, we would be driving somewhere, we'd be going to Phillips Mill to pick up something, or we would be going here and there, and there all of a sudden she would just pull off the road because something would capture her attention. So, and I would say she was had a heavy foot on the wheel, but, we would wheel off the road and she would get out this was when she was using a camera, and she would, spend, 15, 20 minutes walking around and taking pictures. And it was really, I didn't as a child realize that was a little unusual, but that was our childhood, was finding things that really intrigued her. And it didn't really matter where we were. That she would pull over.
I mean, fascinating person. I mean, you look at her, you see who she is through what she's choosing to show us, and it really makes you want to know her. Okay, well, I want to share the time with people who have written in questions, so let's get back to them.
Okay, I'm going to combine two, I hope these people don't mind. But Mindy and Joanne were both asking about color. Mindy said that the paintings of architecture sometimes leave me cold, but her paintings are warm and alive. They draw me in through composition and colors. Can anyone talk about her palette choices, her colors, and tonal relationships? And then Joanne asked, is there any significance to the frequent use of color that appears to be akin to a burnt orange? So it's kind of a two-part question I'll put together, but all about color.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. She didn't talk a lot about color, except that, it was really apparent in her sketchbooks and her writings that color itself was super important, and she often described it in very poetic ways. And And I think that, she often in the sketchbooks would make notations about very specific shades so that she would remember later. And I think that was also a function of taking photographs, like Sally was saying, to capture the color. I don't know that, I think so maybe there's just a, kind of a favorite palette, because you're right, the orange does, the burnt orange does appear over and over again. And in fact, it's actually, the cover of the catalog was sort of in that family also, because it is repeated so often. But I don't know specifically, Sally, do you have any sense, did you ever talk about those choices?
No, I mean, I felt that and I'm actually learning a lot myself now, but I felt that she used more muted tones for quite a long time. And then things, I really felt that once she became ill in the early 2000s, her painting lightened up. And but now reflecting and looking at the two-wheeler in 1964, I'm not sure that I'm really accurate. Maybe it was what I was seeing and it wasn't really what she was painting.
Hard to say.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. Let's take those and then let's start looking at the influence, because I think that's, Jen has put together a fascinating slideshow on that.
Sure. Janine Wade, one of our former guests. Hi, Sally. Do you have any paintings that have special meaning?
Oh, thanks, Janine. Of course I do. It's we have several paintings of my mother's. My mother did a painting. We live on River Road, and my mother did a really wonderful painting looking across at Spencer Saunders' barn. And I was saying earlier, before we were on the call, it was, I believe, in the Mill 90th anniversary show. It's called Sally's Attic, and it is just very special to me, not because it's called Sally's Attic, but it's a view that we look at very, very often. And we live on a busy road, so it's wonderful to look beyond the road and see this beautiful barn, the Saunders own. Yeah.
Nice. And we've got another one, Jen.
Yes, John wants to know, is there a website where we can see more of her work?
Not outside of the Michener, and the whatever archive that they have established there. Yeah.
There is an interview with her. Sorry, Sally, I hope it's okay that I mentioned it. With the Senior Artist Initiative. And I think it's a rare opportunity to hear her talk herself. So
yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at the influence, her influences, because I think it's striking. She definitely has her own voice, but it's fascinating to see who she was looking at. Liz, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. So the one on the, as I'm looking at it on the far left, that's actually Charles Demouth. And so he was from Lancaster. Both actually Sheeler and Demouth were from Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of overlap, but she was really interested, Renninger was really interested in precisionism. But I think in looking at, again, these really close-up cropped compositions of architecture, of architectural elements like the staircases we talked about before, seeing geometry, and highlighting that as a design. This shift between the 2 and 3 dimensions is particularly relevant in Charles Demouth's work. Always reminding us that we're looking at a canvas. There was not this interest in fooling the eye, right? So that's where the kind of border between abstraction and realism was really important to Katharine. That she was constantly reminding us that we're looking at a painting, not at reality, not a window onto the world. And the key scene was also an important factor, an important element in that, because it is so dry. And again, as I mentioned, you can almost see every individual brushstroke, so that the element, the evidence of her hand was always there. So Sheeler and Demouth were also looking at quotidian objects and an interest in the handmade, and also the intrusion of industrialism. That's obvious. That's a lot about what's happening in Demouth's work. And we see some of that in Renninger's early work too. This, the interest in technology and machinery and mechanization and the kind of industrial shifts that were happening in the 50s in this area. Some of that is there too. And I think that contributed to her interest in preserving the material culture of Bucks County and her work. So all of that, I think, comes into play with certainly with Sheeler coming through this area and really appreciating the kind of, simple geometrical elements in the barns around here.
Sally, do you have thoughts to share? Words maybe your mother said to you about Sheeler?
Not really so much, no.
Okay. All right, well, we'll go to the next one. Did you talk about art a lot with your mother, Sally?
Well, we did talk about art, and it was interesting. We talked a lot. We talked more about, what she was doing, and she talked about her exhibitions and not just the galleries, but the shows that she would enter her artwork in. She talked about how when she was canned, she used the word canned when she didn't get into a juried show, and she would sometimes go to those shows anyway, just to see who got in. But, she talked more about, the immediate and what she was working on, if she felt good about it. And when she didn't like something she was working on, she would put it in the closet for a while and just say, she would just put it away and say, this isn't working. So.
Would she come back to those paintings?
She did come back to something. I think especially if it was something that she really liked, that if she really, really was attached to the material, she would just work it through. Sometimes she would just start a whole new canvas. Sometimes she would just rework it.
Yeah. All right, good. So here we have the staircases. What do you say, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a bit about this before, so sort of jumped the gun, but I think it's so fascinating to see Sheeler's painting on the right and then her sketchbook on the left. I mean, they almost look like they could be from the same work. And then, of course, the stairs and pig troughs on the top that we saw already. They're very, I think their common interests are pretty apparent. Certainly their palette's really different. And I think if you were seeing these side by side in person, you would see a very different surface, just with the contrast of materials. But I think there's a definite interest in this sort of modern arrangement of shapes and forms. And again, the connection to the handmade, the handcrafted architecture, that they were both really interested in this area.
Right. All right, Jen, what else do we have under influence? Oh yeah. I mean, this to me really evokes her work.
Yeah, I love this painting. This is My Egypt, I believe. Again, this notion of thinking about the encroaching industrialism. Lancaster, of course, is a farming community, but then we have these smokestacks, these rays across the canvas that divided it into these different, quadrants and sharp triangles, this sunbeam coming from the top left. I mean, these are really pretty typical of his work. And again, this play between a design element, a two-dimensional, canvas, and then the painting beyond, the 3 dimensions beyond. So I think that there's a lot of that. There are a couple early works in the Michener's collection where you can really see that she was kind of playing around with a lot of these compositional choices that Demouth was doing as well. But I think that, that disappears a little bit later on, but this is for sure, he was one of her favorite painters. I mean, she's mentioned that in a couple different interviews.
Okay, and next, Jen.
Yeah, this is great. Paul Strand. So as I mentioned before, she was a big fan of photography. She looked at it. There are a lot of, and I say this because her archive at the Michener is so extensive that I really got a wonderful sense of who she was as a person, but also what she was looking at all the time, which is incredibly important to kind of putting together when you're not, talking to a living artist. There's a lot of detective work that goes on, and so you can see again in this very similar to the Sheeler photographs that we talked about before, Strand's interest in cropping almost everything out of the image here, aside from the geometry that he's constructing really with his composition. this tiny little slice of sky at the top and a tiny little slice of ground at the bottom, no context. Same as with Renninger's work. We were talking about that before the call started, that, you know, she's not painting a barn in a setting. You get a sense, of course, that it's Bucks County if you know it and live here. But we're not looking at at a structure in a setting. We're looking at a design that, you know, she very much has control over creating as an artist. And I love this work on the left too. Strand took a lot of pictures of windows. I think it's very clear the affinity in Renninger's work as well at looking at things through things, right? These very different layers of visual material that she did very often.
All right, and we have another question, or Sally, I'm sorry, Sally, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to either of these.
No, I'm happy to go on to the question.
Okay, all right, Jen.
Okay, Pat said, it seems that even in this painting of the stairs, she is also interested in depicting reality along with her interest in design. I say that because the perspective is obviously accurate. Did you find she was also interested in depicting reality along with her interest in design?
Yeah, for sure. I think she's interested in the kind of boundary, right? The play between reality and abstract. She called herself an abstract realist. I want to also just remind her that the one on the right is Sheeler and the one on the left is Renninger. So I don't think that she took too many liberties with, invention in the architectural works. I think she was pretty true to the sketches. I mean, if you compare a final painting with, the sketchbook in the Michener's collection, there are often, pairs that still exist that are really instructive to see what changes she might have made. It's really more of the paintings of objects where she sort of veers from, and does more of a constructed scene. But I think the reality and so her perspective is always accurate. Yeah, that's an important point because it's, your eye will pick it up if it's not.
Right. So you seem to be reacting to that.
No, I agree. I think she was a realist. I think maybe there was a little bit of what Liz just referenced, a little artistic license, but I think when she did a sketch, I think most of her work was very true to that. And so, especially with staircases, it was the shadowing she would work with, but in the time of day that she would, at what point would she do it and where the light was coming from. But I think she really did stay true to the actual object.
Oh, okay, good. So I'm going to go back, Jen, and pick up some that I skipped ahead, worried about time, but I'd love to see bisected. This is so interesting to me. It's earlier, but it actually looks a little bit later to me. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is the one I actually had in mind when I referenced the work at the Michener that is most like Charles Demouth. I mean, this is a really early one in her career where she was kind of playing with this idea of design and reality. I mean, there's a lot happening in this work, and it's really kind of an outlier. She didn't come back to this, kind of style, this palette. There's nothing else in the collection like it. But I found it pretty fascinating. I sort of saw it as, trying to find her style, thinking about Demouth and thinking about, how she constructs a composition. And this is also at the time where, again, I mentioned earlier in our conversation about the encroaching sort of industrialism of this area. And all of a sudden we have, it looks to me, I read this as like, it's more metaphorical than a lot of her work, right? If we're thinking about this as, the family farm is being threatened by development. That's kind of how I read this in a lot of ways, because you have this like danger sign down at the bottom that she included. You have the farm and these farm equipment, the carts and whatever else, the wagons that are like literally being cut in half by this giant electrical tower. So I think this is a really fascinating one. There's nothing really, I think there are themes in here and elements of it that she repeats later on, but this is really a very interesting outlier in her work.
So do you this is early for you.
This was before me, but you know, it's interesting because my parents lived in Venezuela. This would have been shortly after the return. They lived in Venezuela for, 2 or 3 years, maybe not even that long. And she did a lot of, I don't think we have any photos in this discussion, but she did a lot of paintings down there that were of open markets and a lot of geometric, just the design, lots of geometric shapes. But this is so unusual and different. And I never saw this painting until after she passed away. And it is, as Liz said, it's very, very different. But I think then she moved on to what she was going to kind of focus on.
Looking at the early works though, Jen, we've got Untitled, Place de la Concorde, Paris. So that's 1948. Again, another style and clearly very, very early, but you see that interest in shadow, the lines. I mean, Katharine Renninger is there.
Yeah, these were when she was on her fellowship after Moore. So, it's doing this sort of grand tour. And I think these are the two, I had a couple in the exhibition that were clearly more heavily influenced by Arthur Meltzer and Pauline Van Rokens. And I think this is one of them that she was still thinking about Impressionism. She talked a lot about how influential Cézanne was in her academic training. She used to say, I read once that she said her schooling ended at Cézanne, but she loved, so that I think this is sort of like her Cézanne period, where she's thinking about, much more traditional at that time, academic drawing and recording what she was seeing when she traveled.
Sally, any thoughts on this one?
No, I agree with Liz. And actually during this, she did a lot of pastels while she was on this fellowship, and they're wonderful, but they're very, very different from what she really developed into be really her style.
Well, there are so many stories and aspects to her. I was hoping we'd talk more about her community involvement. She was involved with the Phillips Mill. She was involved with the founding of the Michener. Maybe we can squeak that in, Sally, before we go.
So just, I guess, historically, I mean, both my parents were very involved in the area in many organizations. My mother, lent her hand to different ones, Pensbury Manor, the Historic Society of Newtown, particularly Phillips Mill, and in the early, I believe it was the early 70s, the formation of the Arts Council of Bucks County, which was a small group of individuals, artists, and some business people to promote the arts in Bucks County. And that really grew into the Bucks County commissioners approving an art museum to be built in the mid 80s. So that was a very, very important, a huge thing for her, being an artist, being involved in the building of that structure and the design. And, she was a lifelong member of the board until she was too ill to participate. So, yeah.
Just extraordinary to me that she raised a family. She was an accomplished artist and she was an active member of the community. It's any one of those is a challenge.
She kept a calendar. She had a very accurate calendar, and she didn't make exceptions and she didn't waste time. Yeah, she was disciplined.
I could learn from that. Liz, final thoughts?
No, I agree. I mean, I could talk about her all day. She was so fascinating. And I love well, first of all, I appreciate getting a chance to talk about her work again, and the process of discovering who she was as an artist through the archive. It was just a really wonderful way to get to know Bucks County, to get to know her work and the perspective she had. And that's why, and Sally referenced this, that's why I named the exhibition Craft, Commitment, and Communities, is looking through her date books. I mean, they're all at the museum, and it was just a discovery after discovery of who she was and how dedicated she was to every element of her life and how important it was.
Well, I just have to thank you both so much. It's been a real pleasure to prepare this and have this interview. Sally, I always love talking with you, and I really enjoy hearing about your mother's extraordinary work. So thank you very much. Liz, I was having a lovely time looking at Katharine Renninger's work, and I've discovered so much more in your comments about it. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. Thanks.
We appreciate all of you in the audience joining us tonight for this very special conversation. I encourage you to join us next month, when we're excited about the new exhibition that's coming up at the Michener Reframe, Community Perspectives on the Michener Art Collection. And they've invited a number of different curators to look at the works that we're familiar with. And we're going to see these works again through the eyes of these guest curators. I'm very excited about the exhibit, and I'm very excited to welcome back Dr. Laura Igo, who joined us here tonight. Thank you, Laura, Chief Curator at the Michener, for coming here tonight and for joining us again next month. And we're also excited to welcome Director of Exhibitions, Joshua Lassard. That's July 27th at 7 p.m. Thank you so much to Executive Producer Jen McHugh.
Always fun.
Thank you to our content producers, Jean Mahitch and Dennis Riley. For Phillips Mill Community Association's ArtTalk, I'm Laura Womack. Have a good evening.